Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed Tabakoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Mir-Djalali's of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to the Institute's Iranian Studies book launch featuring Professor Crus's Love at Crux, the new Persian romance in global Middle Ages. We are grateful to Professor Crux for accepting our invitation and also coming to campus today. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Dr. Crux for his tenure and promotion at the University of Michigan, which was announced earlier today. Yeah. We are grateful to Georgian Cultural Heritage Institute and Dr. Elahé Mir-Djalali, who has joined us today for their exemplary support of the Institute. At the outset, and before introducing our speaker, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and the Institute of Iranian Studies operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Vandals, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live, to learn, and teach on their ancestral home. My colleague, Dr. Abulfazl Mushiri, will introduce Professor Crux and also will moderate today's session. Please.
It's my immense pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Cameron Crux, who also goes by his adopted Persian name, Kamran Chedifan, to the University of Toronto and the Institute. Dr. Crux is the Associate Professor of Iranian Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he teaches classes on Persian literature, Iranian studies and cultures, and more broadly, the history of West Asia and Middle East. His research interest centers in the literary tradition of the Nile to Oxus region from about 800 to 1200 CE. Though he also works with classical and late antique texts on one hand, and the early modern and modern texts on the other hand. Persian and Arabic are the two main research languages, along with some French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, German, Middle Persian, Georgian, and other languages perhaps, which helps him to situate Islamicate literary production in a broader comparative context. His most recent book, which is the subject of today's talk, entitled Love at a Crux, the New Persian Romance in Global Middle Age Context, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2024, explores the emergence of romance as a literary genre in Persian language and the idea of romantic love as an ethical praxis within this generic tradition, tracing how the interplay of these two branches raised deep existential challenges for the individual subject to the problematization of classical topoi, like female chastity, male sovereignty, sacrifice, and redemption in the name of love. Dr. Crux, welcome to Toronto, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So it's nice to see all of you, and thank you all for coming. And hello to friends on Zoom. Thank you for coming as well. I'm going to start a timer so I don't go over time, because I'm going to be faced with this new challenge of trying to give an overview of a very long and complicated work in a way that hopefully will give you a sense of what the project is all about. With a few focal points to maybe sink our teeth into, but at the same time, it's a different kind of talk than what I normally give. Okay, my timer didn't work, so I'll just go ahead and start. Maybe give me a 20-minute buzz when I'm halfway through. Thank you. Thank you. So what I thought I would do is sort of tell you a little bit about the genesis of the project, and then walk you through the choices that I made as I decided on the title for the book. What did I mean with this title and subtitle? So I'll start by talking about the new Persian romance in the global Middle Ages. What does all that mean? And then what does it mean to describe love at existing at a crux? If time allows, I can talk a little bit about where I see the research going from here, but I will also try not to tire your patience, and I will stop if I run out of time. So to tell you a little bit about the project, it's like all things academic, I feel much is owed to serendipity. I was interested in Iranian studies as a child, even as like maybe a 10-year-old or so. I started reading about Iran and falling in love with the country from afar. I grew up in Colorado in a very isolated area where I spent much of my life with my imagination dreaming about being in other places besides this remote mountain town. And Iran sort of called to me in a way that no other region of the world did. And so even as a kid, I started wanting to learn Farsi and wanting to sort of immerse myself in this literary tradition, but there was no like diaspora to see. There was no like immediate access to this stuff. As a college student then, I decided the closest thing we had to a history program that dealt with the Middle East was European history. And I focused on medieval European history because there you have at least the Crusades and things like that that helped me sort of get to approach Iran from some angle. And again, we'd had no program in Arabic nor in Persian. So I chose the next closest thing, which was, for whatever reason, I chose Italian as my focal point. So it's sort of a Mediterranean studies framework. But this, by serendipity, gave me a background in medieval Italian literature. And that actually proved crucial in my landing on Persian romances in general and Vis Rāmin in particular, because as I was preparing for, or as I was sort of getting familiar with the classical canon, even though I thought I was going to be a modernist, when I started reading Nizami in particular, I was really struck by how many interesting parallels I saw between Nizami and Dante, for example, the way they talk about love, the kind of architectonics of their work. It's like, there's something really interesting going on here. And then the third thing I have to think is that we can't underestimate the value of good translations. Like when I was getting ready for my comps, where I thought, okay, I'm still going to work on something modern, but I'm going to do a survey of Persian poetic narratives. I just thought, okay, I have my chronological list. I'll start with the first one that's been just come out in translation by Dick Davis, Vis Rāmin, and I had the plan to continue on up through to the modern period. And by the time I was finished reading Vis Rāmin, I said, like, I think I'll stop here and write my dissertation about Vis Rāmin because it was such a compelling text through a compelling translation. So I want to acknowledge the role of translators like Dick Davis in making Persian literature available for non-specialists. I think it's really important work. I'm grateful for it. So I ended up writing about Vis Rāmin. Now, as a quick introduction, this is a text written in the middle of the 11th or 5th century by a poet named Fakhreddin Asad Gorgani. And it's often cited in the literature as one of the first romances. What we mean by that is the question, but we can call it a Dastane Ashrafane in New Persian literature. And the basic plot is a complex plot that I won't get into too much, but it basically revolves around a love triangle between Vis, who's the princess of Ma, or Media, and two brothers who are the king and prince of Mad in the east, of Khorasan. Rāmin, who's the prince and Vis's lover, and Mobad, who is the king of Mad, but also Vis's husband. It's a very old tale, probably of Parthian origin, and it was commissioned by the governor of the new Seljuk governor of Esfahan. So the Esfahan has just been conquered by the Seljuks, Abul Fatim Muzafar. And this is what he says to the poet, according to the poet's own words. Would you like me to read the Persian and you can follow the English, or vice versa? I prefer to read Persian because it's all right. This is the right audience for it. So, چه گویی در حدیث ویس رامین که میگویند چیزی سخت میپوست در این کشور همه کس داردش دوست. بگفتم کان حدیثی سخت زیباست ز گرد آورده شش مرد داناست. ندیدم زان نیکوتر داستانی نماند جز به خرم بوستانی. ولیکن پهلوی باشد زبانش نداند حرفی برکند بیانش. And I'm going to pause here because we see that he describes it as a beautiful thing that's compiled, but this language is Pahlavi. So much ink has been spilt around that line. Just like, what does he mean by Pahlavi? Is it Middle Persian? Is it a Pahlavane, sort of like a kind of style? But the poet continues. He has this interesting discursus on what he's going to do with it, what happens when you versify a story. And he concludes by saying, Agar donandei dar ve barad ranj, shavad ziba cho porgo ganj. If a scholar is to put their effort into it, it would become beautiful as a mine full of gems. And I want to highlight here the focus on two things. Because many people have talked about what's the actual source text, but the poet's point is the language. It's a language that is not clear when you read it. Like the bayan, the meaning of it is not intelligible. And his intervention is a scholarly one. He says a donandei, if a wise person were to put effort into it, it becomes beautiful, like something full of gems. And I think the metaphor of the mine full of gems not only implies beauty, but also value. And elsewhere he says, if you read it, it will be of value to you. So there's some kind of investment in a sense in this. Vis Rāmin has a very interesting reception history. And you can read about it in an article published separately called The Lives and Afterlives of Vis Rāmin. It was translated into Georgian as Vis Rāmiani. Here's a page from the manuscript, and became kind of a canonical or foundational work of literary prose in that language. And it undoubtedly has a huge influence on Nizami Ganjavi, especially in his Khosrow Shirin. But you see, even though it has no immediate retellings, the same way that the Hamse of Nizami does, you find references to Vis Rāmin all over the place, and even quotes from it circulating as far east as Japan within a century of its composition. So it clearly was successful in some ways, but not in other ways, perhaps as a well-known literary work, but also not one that was used as a model for future composition, at least not in terms of linguistic stylistics. However, it does feature one very particular passage called the Dahnameh, which becomes a genre unto itself. And many poets of the 13th and 14th centuries write their own Dahnamehs and insert them into their own literary works. And so that's something that Vis Rāmin is known for. However, when it's described, and by modern scholarship in particular, the language that's often used to sort of place it or to frame it is something that kind of describes it as an outlier or an anomaly or something strange or divergent. It's kind of orphaned in a sense. It's like Davis calls it a cul-de-sac, something that sort of goes and doesn't go anywhere really. And there's been a lot of discussion about why that could be. Even in the manuscript tradition, there's not very many extant manuscripts of it. There's no doubt that the story became famous as a byword for obscenity in some ways. Like Obeide Zaghani describes anyone who reads the Vis Rāmin as coupled, basically. And even in modern editions, there's a very graphic one. There's a graphic Russian translation done by the famous artist, or illustrated by the famous artist Mikhail Romadin. I'm not showing pictures of it, but it's quite pornographic, basically. It's like a Kama Sutra set in Persian. So it sort of says something about the reception, almost the aura that surrounds Vis Rāmin. And it's even when it's sort of rediscovered by modern artists, they celebrate it as a sort of transgressive work. So this image I have here is from a visual series by the artist Ramin Etemadi Bozorg, where he describes it as the story of a secret romance, a lost memory, the recreation of a forbidden document. So this suppressed Persian narrative is all over it. The sort of scholarly tradition, actually, this sort of aura permeates the scholarship on Vis Rāmin. And a good example is this citation from the editor of Nizami's works, Hasan Vahi Dasgirdi, where he says in his romances, he sees Nizami as effectively trying to repair the damage done by Vis Rāmin. He writes, in his romances, Khosrow and Shirin and Layli Majnun, Nizami brought love and chastity to the utmost level of perfection as if stirred to action by Gorgani's versification of Vis Rāmin, which is in truth a disgusting fable, right? افسانه است زشت و کتابی است دشمن ناموس و خصم تاریخ عظمت اخلاقی ایران. A book hostile to the edicts of law and religion and an enemy to the history of Iran's moral grandeur. So he's saving Iran from the damage done by Gorgani. And this is not an outlier. The very first scholarship we see, Ito Lopizzi has this really great thing where he describes Gorgani as a miserabile poetastro, a miserable poetaster, a vulgar book for vulgar folk. And even as recently as 2008, a book in an article called Sharmu Ozan Adabiyat Farsi, something like that, Ziauddin Jawadi writes, this story is a kind of insult to Iranian people. So this is kind of a leitmotif in the scholarship, found in as names as large as Foruzan Fad, Gabrieli, Balsani, Ripka, Tamin Dari, Musafiri. And I don't mean to turn it into a monolith, of course. Much of the scholarship done on Vis Rāmin has recognized its importance as a historical work and a philological document, as a source for understanding the Parthian period or for this early Celtic period, for exploring archaic New Persian mythology. Like these things are very interesting work. And even as a literary text, scholars such as Sadegh Hedayat, Amin Damani, Virgil, Eslami Nodushan, Maysami, Southgate, and Davis have all written very useful and helpful studies of the work. But I would say by and large, the general tendency, even in these more positive assessments, has been to treat Vis Rāmin as an abnormality, basically to orphan it as something weird, something unusual. And it sparks a kind of, this produces two different trends, I feel, in the general reception of this work so far. One is to, if you isolate it as something unusual, it produces a kind of comparative scholarship that looks for other weird or aberrant or abnormal or transgressive texts. And therefore, one of the most productive or prolific areas of scholarship has been to find another text that Western scholars think of when they think of transgressive, which is Tristan and Isolde, also featuring the love triangle that is adulterous. And so a lot of work has been done to try to find some kind of connection between Vis Rāmin and Tristan and Isolde, usually along the lines of source research. Like, is there an ur-text connecting the two? Is there some kind of paper trail? Or even if you're not doing that kind of comparison, it's usually a linear comparison. The inevitable point of comparison is Gorgani and Nizami, right? Gorgani did this, Nizami did that. And almost always the comparison is unfavorable. Gorgani inevitably becomes the inferior poet when you do this kind of linear genealogy. What I proposed to do then with this was to shift the frame entirely, the axis of, instead of taking this kind of vertical axis, which is a literary national axis. This is something that goes as far back as Brown, A Literary History of Persia, right? You identify the language and you write a linear diachronic history of the Persian literature through time. First there's Gorgani, then there's Nizami, then there's Amir Khosrow, and there's Jami, right? Which isolates the language as the only point of study. And it's a vertical one that goes across time. And to shift that to a horizontal synchronic axis, to not look at what's going on before and after, but how does Vis Rāmin make sense in its own place and time? And not one that is limited to just the Persian language, but what's going on in Arabic, what's going on in Greek, what's going on in Georgian, that might help us maybe not see it so much as a weird text. Maybe it's not that weird if you situate it in its actual context, instead of reading it in terms of what's before it and what's after it. And this means a different kind of modality or method. It's not a genealogy or source criticism, right? It's not trying to devise some kind of family tree. It's rather a shift to structural and thematic comparisons, things that are not necessarily directly related through a textual tradition, but rather ways of telling stories that are comparable. What I call the mythos and ethos of romance. The mythos being the kind of structural elements, and the ethos might be the kind of practices that one finds in these things. And therefore, the main form of engagement is a kind of discourse analysis. I'm looking for the language that in which these stories are told and the kinds of ideas that are conveyed within these discourses. Yeah, I'll come back to it. So it's kind of a dialogic, trans-regional and trans-linguistic sort of undertaking. And the kinds of questions that emerge from this framing these are some of the major ones I identify, is that is there such a thing as the Persian romance? I mean, we use this term, but of course it's an import from Eurocentric traditions, right? So can we use the word romance to describe Vis Rāmin? I would say probably not, at least not for immediately. Gorgani would have had no sense of, this is a romance, I'm writing a romance. He says, I'm writing a dastane ashabane. That's a love story, but it's not quite a romance as what it means today when we use the English term. But we still recognize it as a romance. There's something familiar about it. And so as modern readers or comparativists, what happens when we recognize a text as a romantic one? What happens if is there a kind of recognition that is possible in this recognition? Can we rethink the term itself and what it means by recognizing something that we have to acknowledge we are creating or we are imposing this label on the text, right? But what possibilities for study does that imposition open up? So therefore, if we recognize romance through our recognition of Vis Rāmin as a romance, how does that change our understanding of the history of romance itself? What does that look like from a Persian perspective? And some questions that come from that are, what are the origins of Persian romance? And how do we better perceive its connectedness with adjacent discursive domains? And here I think what's especially important are Greek and Arabic as these widespread languages of discourse before the emergence of New Persian, and that proved formative for Persian on one hand, and for many Western European vernaculars, Middle Greek, of course, in the Byzantine realms, and then in Western Europe, Latin and the vernaculars are all in dialogue with the Latinate and Greek traditions. So there's basically late antiquity feeding into a shared discursive network that I will talk about a little bit more later. So that was sort of the backdrop to how I came to this approach. And now I'll unpack for you what I mean by the new Persian romance in the global Middle Ages. New is actually, there's a bit of iham in here. It's new can refer to a couple things. It's new Persian and a new romance, i.e. we're seeing a new way of telling love stories that dovetails with the rise of New Persian as a new literary language. This is, again, the middle of the 10th century, or the 11th century. So Ferdowsi has only recently passed away. Only now are the Seljuks starting to bring Persian language patronage into the central lands of Islamdom. And it's maybe an important milestone in the history of Persian literature as a literary language that gains the prestige that it later does. And to describe this change, I want to give you a couple, just a kind of a backstory to how I see Persian doing something, or New Persian doing something that's new. And I'm going to warn you, I'm going to show a lot of names at you on the slides. You don't have to read them. They're just sort of meant to exemplify what I see going on as far as broader trends. When you look at the way that literateurs and philosophers and critics talk about love stories in the Abbasid period, for example, they tend to be described as evening entertainment. The word that's used a lot is samar, asmar in Arabic. Sometimes they're called khurafat, or the Persian equivalent of afsane, right? And a really interesting, and this is in distinction to stories that tell, or narratives that are about prophets, or kings, or heroes, or people who are recognized as existing in history, in space and time. A really interesting example of this distinction is found in Ibn Nadim's Fihrist, where he describes various kinds of asmar. He has a group called the asmar and a group called the asmar al-sahiha. So evening stories and true evening stories. And if you look at the true evening stories, what do we see? Rostam Esfandiar, Bahram Chobin, Parviz, Anushirvan, Dara, the Book of Customs, the Book of Lords, Bahram, the son of Anushirvan. This is all Shahnameh material, right? This is all the Book of Lords material, or books about royal protocol and customs more broadly. These are the things that Ibn al-Qafa translates. There's a very strong interest in Sasanian royal protocol, Sasanian Andaj literature, basically, and historiography as a source of wisdom. On the other side, what do we have? 1001 Nights, The Miserly King, The Bear and the Fox, Ruzbeh the Orphan, Nimrod, the King of Babylon, and a couple interesting titles that I have in yellow that have this nomenclature that makes me think of the romance genre, right? Moshdoneh ou Shah Zanon, right? There's something that has a romance feel to it, like we have the prince and the princess or something like that. But we don't have any traces of these texts, but they are lumped together with 1001 Nights, animal fables. Things are understood as fairy tales, Horafat, Afsaneh. And you see the same distinction reflected in the early history of Persian masnavis, which is like this important way of telling stories in verse form. And of course, we know that versification is a way of adding prestige to a work. Most of these texts are no longer extant, but we have lists of the kinds of works that were patronized by the Samanids. And again, Pharaoh Majnameh, Shahnameh, Belohar Bodhisattva, this is the Barlam and Josaphat story. Khalil Wadimna, a very prestigious work to translate. The Senbadnameh, Yusuf Zolikha, this is the story of a prophet. It's in the style of the stories of the prophets, the Qasas al-Anbiya. Mawlud Zarathustra, the story of Zarathustra. So again, you have heroes, you have kings, you have advice literature, you have prophets, you have sages. The Danish-Nameh, the Al-Fari-Nameh, advice literature, medical works. These are all up to Ferdowsi. Then we get to Ferdowsi, next is this interesting cusp. And suddenly you see all these yellow texts here. These are all love stories. These are all romances in the sense that these are independent stories about a pair of like an amorous couple and their adventures. And we have a couple major figures associated with this. Unsuri, who's a poet laureate for Mahmud of Ghazna, has 3 of these. We only have traces of 1. Ayubi has, but those 3 by Unsuri are drawn from Greek literature, I will add. One of the Vamiko Azra is a translation of a Greek novel from 1,000 years beforehand. So a Greek Hellenistic novel tradition. Ayubi, at the same time, versifies the love story of Ordwa and Afra, which is very similar to Layli and Majnun. It's called Bab in Shah. And then shortly thereafter, Gorgani versifies this Middle Persian Parthian tale of Vis Rāmin. So they're drawing from either archaic or pagan traditions in a sense, pre-Islamic basically, traditions of love stories that are not just Iranian in origin, but also Greek and Arabic. And so kind of a movement, I think it could be traced basically to the court of Mahmud of Ghazna. It gets picked up by the Seljuks, by a number of specific people. And Gorgani himself helps us understand a little bit how he sees his work. Again, this idea of bringing meaning to a text, to a façonné, to a fairy tale. He says, که آنگه شاعری پیشه نبوده است حکیمی چابک اندیشه نبوده است کجااند آن حکیمان تا ببینند که اکنون چون سخن می آفرینند معانی را چگونه برگشادند بر او وزن و قوافی چون نهادند فسانه گرچه باشد نغز و شیرین به وزن و قافیه گردد نو آیین. So the key here is he's saying that with my techniques, especially rhyme and meter, but he also mentions adding ghazals, adding similes, and parables into the work, it becomes something nuayin, something new, a new way of telling love stories that is valuable. And here, how am I doing on time?
You're 23 minutes.
23 minutes? I'll read a quick passage from my book because this might be helpful at the transition. So I argue basically, and here I'm quoting myself, we thus find in this introduction that we see here a detailed manifesto of the broader literary movement that took shape in the early 11th century, in which Persian court poets recognized new possibilities in the popular stories, evening entertainments, and legends of the distant past, and embarked on a project of imbuing them with meaning in hitherto untried and unthinkable ways. This process entailed a complex reappraisal of the relationship between elevated discourse, sohan, in some ways comparable to logos, and the production of mental contents, ma'ani, in ways both rich and profound. For unlike other textual traditions inherited from the pagan past, such as philosophy, medicine, moral guidance, history, and so on, the love story had no clear purchase on an inherent value or truthfulness to it. Thus, the act of refashioning this material into something valuable was not so much an act of discovering the diamond in the rough, as the saying goes, but of creating diamonds out of so much charcoal. I think the word off-badinet, me off-badinet, this off-badinesh of something, is I'm thinking about creation as a very daring verb to use. The end result is of an entirely new manner in relation to its source. As a result of these efforts, a distinctive literary genre, what we now retrospectively call the Romance, emerged as a viable and prestigious kind of writing in New Persian, and as time went on, the Persian world at large. And here I'm being a little bit cautious. I would actually say more than just the Persian world, because when you situate this, again, in a long view and not looking only at Persian, we see a very interesting kind of movement taking across the wider expanse of what Hutchin would call the Western oikoumene, right? So in this map, you see the earliest romances all taking place in the Iranian East, in Khorasan, up to Gorgani's transplanting into Elahé Ajam in Esfahan in the 1050s. By the time we get to the year 1100, we see more such stories being narrated up in Azerbaijan now, including a Georgian text, the Amiran Darajaniani, which has it's kind of like a romantic epic. By the time you're at 1150, there's a resurgence of the Greek novel tradition at the Byzantine court. You have more prose romances that had a lot of love stories in them, like Samak Ayar or the Arabic That al-Himma. And also in France, you have reversifications of like the Roman de Tête, the Romance of Thieves, which has a lot of erotic, amorous material, and the love story of Flore and Blanchefleur, which Seyd Bourrat has identified as being basically parallel to Ayubi's text, about Shah. By the time you get to the years 1200, you can see that in Western Europe, the genre is flourishing. And in fact, contemporaneously, I've highlighted in yellow some big names. The canon is being established in this genre across, basically from France to Afghanistan. Chrétien de Troyes and writing in Old French, or Gottfried von Strasbourg writing in Middle German. In Georgian, you have Shota Rustaveli writing The Knight in the Panther's Skin, which is like the poem in Georgian literature. And Nezami, of course, in Persian. They're all contemporaneous to each other, and they're all working in very comparable literary forms of versified love stories. So there's something comparable here, and it's not something that's traceable to source texts. It's rather something else. Iokitos and Mortensen describe this in this work, Medieval Narratives, as a broad and open system of distinct and yet interrelated regional cultures that come to display some highly marked common ways of artistically and intellectually expressing similar preoccupations and needs. So that's the comparability here. We're looking not so much at source texts or genealogies, we're looking at modalities. And hence, I think you can describe this as a global, with some qualifications, Middle Ages. It's not a literal global Middle Ages. We're not talking about the actual globe, but something beyond the local, something that is trans-regional, maybe hemispheric in a sense, but something that really moves beyond any one literary tradition in the national literary history model that we've inherited. And one way I've tried to articulate this complex is I haven't invented it, but I've rephrased works of earlier scholars to coin the idea of the Helleno-Abrahamic complex. These are all, if you look at this map, these are all this is an area, this is an expanse where you could say certain names and they would be meaningful, recognizable names. Names like Plato, names like Moses, names like Alexander. If you said that name in England or in Afghanistan, those are meaningful names. And that points to the fact that there's a shared prophetic tradition on one hand and a shared Hellenistic discursive tradition on the other. So there is a certain basic grammar of meaning making that allows for mutual intelligibility and recognition, even if it's not based on like a source-to-source transmission. So that's kind of like one of my methodological framings. So that hence this is where Middle Persian is, or New Persian is falling in this broader medieval, global Middle Ages idea. Now, eleventh crux, why did I choose that term? Many have thought I was doing some coy self-inscription in there with the cross and crux. And I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but in fact, rather, what I was thinking of is that crux has a lot of useful meanings for describing this. On one hand, it's a project that places Iran at the crux, i.e. the kind of crossroads of convergence and divergence. It's a space where the Iranian, Arabic, and Greek traditions are being gathered together and synthesized into something new, and a kind of crucible, another kind of cruxy word, and that then you can see various kinds of divergence from that. At the same time, I would like to argue that these romances are at the crux, in the sense of at the turning point of this phenomenon, as I showed in the maps. And then finally, as a literary text, moving from the general to the specific, I think Vis Rāmin, this book itself, splits the genre on a kind of crux. It tortures it, it crucifies it in a weird way, literally pulling it apart and really stressing its inner contradictions, exposing its machinery, and challenging it to do something new. So it's not, again, this idea of no ayin, a no sazi, a new form of telling romance that's not just a reiteration of the kind of status quo, but something that basically deconstructs it and produces something new out of that. And so I'll focus on how this deconstruction happens in the remaining minutes I have. This, again, I'm drawing inspiration from the text itself, because Gorgani at one point has this really interesting aside where he addresses his readers with these words. Beguyam ba to yek pali an ma che ba daye che ba ramin che ba shah be goftari ke chun ashaq bekhanad be dard dil ze dide khun chekanad beguyam dastane ashaqane. Here's where he names his own text as a dastane ashaqane bedu dar ishq ra chandin fasane. It's a dastane ashaqane that has many tales, chandin fasane, within it. And he names his stories. This is the story of Vis with the nurse, the story of Vis with Rāmin, and the story of Vis with the king Mobad. And so I use that as a way to structure my body chapters. Each one focuses on these stories within the story, and how each one offers a kind of image of language or a discursive field. And here I draw from the Greek term theoria, which basically means a way of looking, a nazar, basically, different theories of Eshkwazi, of different theories of love in the world, what it means to be a lover. So to offer a quick run through of which each theory offers, which each nazar or digahibe masale. First, I begin with Vis as ethics, and I call it an affair of conscience. And here, my point of departure is the ancient Greek novel, because as in my reading, we find basically the building blocks of the mythos and ethos of these Persian romances visible. And those same building blocks are also visible in Arabic stories and in Western European literatures. So you can see how these poets are using these elements to tell certain kinds of stories and imbue them with certain ethical practices, with certain ethos, as a sense of ayin, basically a certain way of, certain habit of being in the world. Some of these core values that are carried by these stories, these will be very familiar, I'm sure. Chastity is very important. It's called pakizehi in the text. Fidelity, bafa, is super, super important, probably the primal thing. And sabro shakibai, forbearance, or, like withstanding the trials and tribulations of life. And because the basic core of these stories is that you have two lovers that are perfectly matched for each other. They have a chance encounter, they immediately fall in love, and then they get separated for some reason. And they have lots of adventures. And the point is to see how they hold up and withstand all these challenges. And then they either come back together and marry and live happily ever after, or in a twist on that, they don't come back together and it becomes a kind of martyrdom narrative. Their grave becomes a site of pilgrimage, but either way, they become exemplars of this ideal of Bethel, basically. In a very interesting read of this story, Davis points out that Vis Rāmin, it challenges the kind of simple setup. And most of these stories, it's very obvious who the lover and the beloved are supposed to be. But he identifies all these false starts in the narrative where we are led to, if we approach it from the horizons of expectations that the Greek novel gives us, we're not sure who Vis is supposed to be in love with, basically. You have kind of a whole setup where it's Vis and Viru, her brother, that seems to be the story we're hearing. And then whoops, let's put that to the side. We'll start up again with Vis Rāmin. And it moves back and forth between these two narratives. And you see Vis basically left with this interesting position where there's no clear option for her. And this is intensified. This is one of the taboo aspects of this story with the theme of incest on one hand, like Viru being the kind of mirror image of her family. So it's kind of this perfect match idea, but also a more broad use of mirror images, simulacra, doppelgangers. Like a common phrase in Vis Rāmin is like, it's as if you two are cut from the same apple. Don't even seed, right? And it's like that shows appropriateness, but it also allows all kinds of weird sublimations to happen. For example, the reason why Mobat has a claim on Vis is because he propositions her mother, and her mother says, well, you can't have me, but you can have my daughter. And he says, well, she will surely look exactly like you. Or then later on, Vis is in love with Viru. She sees Viru as her perfect match, and she's convinced otherwise that actually Rāmin looks exactly like Viru. And so it has this interesting question about the ontology of love. And let me just give an example. It's like this ship of Theseus problem. Suppose we have Layli and Majnun. What if I were to clone Layli? So there's two Laylis. And then I ask Majnun, which one are you going to devote yourself to? You can't have two Bedlays for your dean. You have to have just one point of love. But which one is it? It raises this really interesting question about the chasm between surat and matni, basically, or zahir and batin, right? And so Vis has this really interesting problem of having kind of a cloned offer of who she's going to be in love with, but neither one is the right choice. Either she commits incest according to Islamic law, or incest according to Islamic law, because her Rāmin is her male brother, and in both cases she commits adultery. So there's no good choice for her to do. Because there's no right way to go forward, she creates her own ethics. She produces her own ethical reading of the situation that results in the paradox of adultery as fidelity. That in fact, what looks like adultery is in fact fidelity. And we know that Rumi and other poets really love this idea. But like something that encapsulates her position, I think, is when she says, منم با یار در صد کار بیکار به گاه مهر با صد یار بیار هم یار است و هم شو هم برادر من از هر سه همی سوزم برآذر. I have all these people, none of them are correct, and I am tortured by, I am sent to hell by, I burn in fire from all three of them. So that's ethics. How am I doing on time? Okay. Yeah, good. Interestingly, Mobad, the king, which is the next chapter, says exactly the same lines. So he's in a tight space himself. He says to his readers, Nigar ta to chunin kerdar didi, vaya as hiç danande shnidi ke chandin bar ba man kar kard Rāmin, delam ra sir kard az jan shirin, hame sale hami suzam barazar. So again, he's quoting Vis himself, ز دست دایه و بیست و برادر اگرچه شاه شاهان جهانم ز خود بیچاره تر کس را ندانم. Despite the fact that he has all the power in the world, he's the bichare tarin kas jahan. He's the most helpless of all these people. He's again tortured by all these plentiful options, of which none are the right choice for him. So Mobad is a really interesting figure for me, and I could I'll read maybe a sentence from my book because in a sense, like with Vis, we see all these doubles around her, where she's very protective of her integrity. With Mobad, it's the opposite. He's sort of like Vis in reverse. He contains doubles within him. There's a lot of ways that I explore this in the chapter. The first one is that he identifies with Jamshid, Yima, who is himself a twinned king, right? He's literally cut in half in the Shahnameh, you might remember. And Jamshid also represents the pairing of kingship with priesthood. Jamshid at once says, Manam ba Fari Izadi, Hamam Shahriyari, Baham Mobadi, right? I'm both Mobad and king in one person. And I think that Mobad, in his very name, evokes this idea of divine kingship, right? And he also brings together this sort of superficial convergence of perfect manhood, perfect loverhood, perfect kingship that Mesami writes about. Like if you're a perfect man, you are also a perfect lover, you are also a perfect king. And yet there's this kind of doubling, there's this multitudes contained within this image that actually pushes him in different directions. And some of the ways that you see these tensions manifested are in the polyvalence of the word Mir, which means both sun, he beholds the Jamshidian sun in Shahru and desires it for himself, even though he embodies it. But it's also the word for love, and it's also the word for contract. And then by writing a contract, he creates a kind of a bond between himself and Shahru, which simultaneously projects his authority. You know, it says, I have the right to marry Vis now, and it subjects him to that authority. Now he must act if that bond is broken, right? And that's precisely what happens. And so he has no choice but to attack the very people he's trying to marry, right? So it produces this kind of self-destructive impulse or like result out of doing the things that his image demand he do. And there's really interesting passages that speak a lot to suicide, self-castration, self-destruction through every sensible action he takes as king, as lover, as perfect man, undermines that very image that he embodies. So I find his story very, very thought-provoking and very complex and interesting. For the sake of time, I might skip the reading I have from it, but it's basically this idea where he undoes his own image. He destroys his own mirror as he does the sensible thing. So it's kind of like this interesting contrapunctual story alongside Vis. To wrap up, the last figure that I look at is Rāmin, who's another departure from the scripts. One of my favorite passages from the poem is when Vis, he's not exactly like what you expect out of an ideal lover. Vis's brother goes to her one day and says, Nagui to as Rāmin chedidi, chara ura ze har kas bargozidi, به گنجش در چه دارد مرد گنجور به جز رود و سرور و گنج و تنبور همین داند که تنبوری بسازد بر او راهی و دستانی نوازد نبینندش مگر مست و خروشان نهاد جام نزد می فروشان. So he's just like I think a lot about like the modern situation, like, did you have to hook up with a rock star? Like, it's like, all he does is he plays a few tunes and like, he's worthless, right? And that's truly like his character, that he doesn't really live up to the same ideal expectations that Vis holds him to. But he also does this very interesting thing in terms of his language. And so here I'm really interested in again, Vis Rāmin as a polyglossic or heteroglossic sort of document, in the sense that it invokes the language of the ghazal without actually using it, that it produces multiple speech acts multiple discursive presences in the text that go into dialogue with each other. I have a lot of ways I try to unpack this. I have this idea of mode switching, kind of code switching, producing different kinds of languages within the same space. And the idea of lyrical abstraction, where what's interesting about this is that you never see actual ghazals in the story, like you see with IOB. You see images of the ghazal, sort of representations of the ghazal taken out of the ghazal form in Rāmin's songs, and they become embodied within his figure. As the minstrel, he sort of becomes a walking, talking lyric, in a sense. And a lot of this work is to sort of interrogate the function of these songs in the story. Many of the critics of Vis Rāmin up to this point have complained about how boring Vis Rāmin gets when Rāmin enters the story, because all he does is he sings songs about how sad he is, and like song after song, it's like, okay, like it's not moving the story forward at all. Why can't we just get to the point? And my idea is that maybe that is the point, is to be stuck, to show the stuckness that happens when you introduce polyglossy, or like when you move from monologue to dialogue, in the sense of Bakhtin's theory of the novel, in the sense that no longer is there a clear discursive set of expectations as to how this relationship is supposed to work. Rāmin says all these things that remain after the speech act ends and has impacts on the story, and it produces a kind of discussion and disagreement between the two lovers as to what their relationship is supposed to look like, leading to basically a crisis of authority. Who gets to say what is right and what is wrong, essentially? Leading to an unprecedented moment in the history of love stories in this genre, as far as I've seen, a breakup. Like, you never see Layli Majnun break up, right? You never see the heroes of the Greek novels break up. The whole point is that they stay together till the bitter end. But Vis Rāmin have a falling out. And the really nice line, Rāmin says, "Togofti mehriman bud e ajab keen," as if it transforms my very love into anger, right? And so I can jump forward. How am I in time? These are my last few slides. So I don't want to,
45 minutes.
We're at 45 minutes. Would you like to, I'll give you one quick example and then I'll wrap up. Just to give you an example of what I mean by abstract ghazals. I found that Rāmin's language is not only semantically similar to the ghazal, but even sonically it evokes the ghazal in really interesting ways. So, for example, this passage where he's singing, you can see the rhyme in. I won't read the whole thing, but you can see it. Hamigofti ke ma dar do yek yarin be yari yekdigaro jan separim be hangami vafar ganje vafaim be cheshme dutmanon tire jafaim, and it continues all these monorhymes. And that reminds me of the matla of a ghazal, right? The first line of ghazal, which sets up the rhyme. So you see a certain sonority in Rāmin's speech that sort of makes you think of the ghazal without actually producing real ghazals, right? And I'll skip this a little bit, but the main point is that it leads to this crisis of authority. And in the final act of the book, you see this really interesting turn to metatextuality, where both Vis Rāmin try to argue their case essentially to their readers. And here we see them stepping outside the story and into history, so to speak, sort of creating their own reality. Rāmin does this through the ghazal performance tradition. He describes himself as a qarib, and he mentions all these other famous qariban. You can, again, think of Majnun, as like these lovers who are famous for their love, right? So he puts himself into this canon of lovelorn poets. Vis takes a very different tack. She does it through testimony and through writing. And she says she treats both her physical body as a kind of book. She says, for example, my heart is like a book full of toil and pain. Or, oh, lovers who practice love. Again, she's speaking to her audience. Look at me, hear my story. If you don't know what happened to me, I've written a tale in blood on my face. You can read it there. So just by looking at her body, she embodies a story that can be beheld and that endures as a kind of testament. In addition to that, she's the author of famous Dahnameh, which uses really strong anaphoric patterns. I have a page from the manuscript called In Paris, where you can see all up and down the entire page, a repetition of the same phrase over and over. This it's blocked out, but like the first one says durud as man bedon cheshme thanks ayar sarkesh. Can you read the rest of it? It's like ke darad namarad. All right. So this durud as man bedon so and so, and then ke darad so and so. This is really powerful anaphora that goes on for many, many lines as a way of sort of establishing herself as a historical presence. And one of my favorite passages of this, and that I chose for the cover of the book, is when she defines herself as somebody who exists, in a sense, beyond the scope of the text, that she remains even after the story's over. Manon visam ki ruyam aftabas, manon visam ki muyam mojganabas, manon visam ki chehram no baharas. من بیستم که مهرم پایدار است، من بیستم که ماه میهبانم، من بیستم که شاه جادوانم، من بیستم که ماهم بربخان است، من بیستم که نوشم در لبان است، من بیستم که بودی تو سلیمان من شد بیست. You just the sheer, there's an effect that's happened when you read it out loud with the anaphora and repetition that sort of establishes her as someone who's capable of bearing witness and leaving testament, in the same way that you see kings in the Shahnameh leave an act, a testimony for posterity. So the story ends. So basically, the whole point of all these studies is to show how time and again Vis Rāmin takes the conventions of romance and breaks them apart, shows them that they actually aren't workable and they need to be redone, rebuilt in some way. And I think that there's a really interesting scene with, as the tail end of the breakup, where Vis and Rāmin get in this epic fight that ends with them, I think, metaphorically killing each other. They leave each other, they abandon each other to die in the snow. So you have this kind of reciprocal murder, but then before they actually die, there's a kind of divine intervention, a supernatural force that brings them back together, sort of creates this idea of a rebirth, a resurrection, and thus united, they overthrow Mobad and end the story. So it's not just a return to a status quo, it's truly a new order that's established, not just for the genre, but for the world that the genre projects. And it ties back into the panegyric of the Seljuks as establishing a new order that is not a reconstitution of something previous, but rather something that brings together faith and power in ways that have never been seen before, except perhaps in the time of the Prophet. So final conclusions then is that I think that this story helps us think a little bit about this really interesting formula that we hear at Persian fairy tales, Yeki Bud, Yeki Nabud. Or can and what can, right? This idea that there's an ambivalence there, that it happened, but it didn't happen. It was there, but it wasn't. It had, like, which one is it? It's inhabiting that tension between fantasy, tahil, and history that enables a broadening of what meaningful speech can look like. From what I call like lives that matter, from biography basically, to experiences of life that matter, that those can be just as productive of truth and meaning as the kind of traditional sources of wisdom, i.e. prophetic biographies, wisdom literature, and that sort of thing. And I think this does fit in with broader currents where we see fantasy, tahil, being discussed in new ways by philologists and philosophers in the 10th century, the 11th century, of thinking about what is possible with majaz, and especially this idea of the majaz, how can you get to the truth through something that's a metaphor, basically. So that participates in a broader discursive tradition of producing meaning in love stories that I think is not ultimately a Persian thing entirely, but rather a phenomenon that you see happening throughout broader Western oikoumene. And I'll end with a very nice line that Morgani leaves us with, reflecting on this dialogue between discourse or storytelling and history that we insert ourselves to through telling of stories. He writes, Choma as Raptagon Girim Akhbar, as ma farda khabar girand nachar. Khabar gardim o ma bude khabar jui, Samad Gadi mo khud bude samad hui. Just as we take tidings from those who have passed, tomorrow they will take them from us. In seeking a story, we become one ourselves. In telling a tale, we pass into legend. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
One that we thought was always
Well, it's very well out.
the brilliant talks and thought-provoking. Definitely. Floor is open for questions. Also, online audiences, they can type in, if I'm not mistaken. There are questions.
Maybe I can take down the.
Yes. Yes, so of course. Hold on. It was a lot.
I know my story. Thank you very much. This was such a rich talk. So much thought. It's provoked so much thought. I've read the original. I haven't read your book, so this is going to lead me in many different directions. I'm going to try not to digress. So I actually have two things that I wanted to ask you. One is the Zoroastrian background, right? Minorski believed it was a Parthian romance, right? So it's supposed to reflect the pre-Islamic Zoroastrian past. And there's so many indications, like word choice, you know, you mentioned the word keen, like all these things that mean something in Zoroastrian literature. Even the name of the king, Mubad, I mean, like Zoroastrian priest. That's really your name. So, and it's written after Ferdowsi, and Ferdowsi suppresses that Zoroastrian aspect, right? He masks it because he's obviously writing for an Islamic audience, a Muslim audience. But I don't see that in Vis Rāmin. I mean, he's really upfront with it. And the thing is that, okay, so you have, let's not call it incest. It's next of kin marriage. Yeah, sure. Okay. Because it's something which is condoned and actually very desirable in Zoroastrians. Right. But in the case of Vis, she never consummates her marriage with her brother. And she never consummates her marriage with Mubad. What's up with that?
Okay, so I respond.
Weird?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's funny because the sort of superficial excuse given is that she's menstruating when they get married, but then they continue to cohabitate for 6 months. And so, like, it's sort of like, that's not the real story here. There's something.
And then God is rendered impotent by her nurse, by this talisman. So he never has sex with her.
Yes, well.
So how does that play into this story? That's my first question.
Let me try to answer those in reverse then. Like this, let me think. I mean, I feel that the long arc of the story sort of points towards a transformation happening through, that's only possible through a very prolonged and difficult relationship with Rāmin, basically. There's certain norms about chastity, I feel that, well, it's not exactly chastity, it's more norms about fidelity, perhaps, that get, I almost think that maybe at the end of the day, virginity is not really the end game of this. It's really about fidelity in a sense. And the big transition that happens is Vis detaching herself from Yuru, to whom she's totally committed, to reattaching herself to Rāmin in a way, in a manner of her own choice, and on terms that she sets, that Rāmin then fails to live up to. So I guess I might just downplay the extramarital sex in this sense. I feel like it's been, not that it's not important, but it's just been so much the focal point of the reception. I think it overshadows what some of the other issues going on. But at the end of the day, I think it helps resolve the story to have for Vis to continue to uphold that model of female chastity that so many of these novels stress as fundamental, especially for the women characters. Like many of the male protagonists of these stories do have affairs with other people, but it's less common to see women having really any kind of sexual encounter outside of the person that they ultimately end up with. But the broader question about the interest in the Zoroastrian past, I mean, Ferdowsi himself is very interesting in the way he engages with it, but I agree that there's a kind of smoothness to the transition from, say, the Kayana dynasty to the dynasty of Gostas. Like there's a lot of kind of back projection of even Islamic ideas into the practice of Zoroastrianism. Like he'll say Kaykalvus was, praying towards the fire, but the fire was just the mihrab of that time. It's the same practice. And in fact, like what I see really interesting, and almost as an expansion of that idea in this moment in time, is there's a diversity of sources being brought to the table. Again, Onsori is drawing from Greek traditions. Ayyubi is drawing from Jahiliya traditions. It's like at the cusp of the coming of the prophet. And Gorgani from pre-Islam, from Zoroastrian traditions. And they're all making an argument that there's something valuable to be gained from looking at stories that are set in those locales. And so actually one of my current projects is to look at Onsori's depictions of pagan Greece and thinking about this is a moment when Mahmud of Ghazni is invading India year after year. Al-Biruni is in India writing Mal al-Hind, thinking, and he's trying to also find a kind of wisdom in what the people like the Hindus do, and writing, and his way of triangulating it is he says what they do is the same as he calls them like the al-Yunaniyun bi ayyam al-Jahiliya. So like there's this idea of like there's a certain ignorance or a certain like a pre-revelation sort of moment, and yet you have Socrates, and yet you have philosophy, and the same kind of wisdom Biruni argues is available in Hindu sources. So there seems to be an interest in otherness, basically. And I think the romance is really good for that because the romance itself as a genre is all about recognizing the self in the other, right? That's the whole point of like this seeing the self in outside of yourself, So
laboratory of love.
Yeah.
Experiment.
So there may be something about this kind of interest in like both the past and the other, like both the temporal and geographic or cultural others, and the genre that they sort of complement each other.
And writing for a Turkic patron.
Yes.
Too.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other dimension too. Thank you. I'm not going to ask my other question. Maybe later, if you'll allow me, I will ask another one. Okay, later. No. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll use my own privilege to ask a short question. You mentioned, by the way, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for coming all the way, driving all the way from Ann Arbor. We really appreciate it.
It's absolutely worth it to be amongst esteemed colleagues.
Of course, many hopefully that you will join us more in the future. I wanted to know about the lyrical aspect of, especially Khazar. You mentioned a very important. Not only this gives birth to the genre of romance, but also perhaps if you look at it the way you looked at it, also gives, because during this time the Ghazal was Persian Ghazal was becoming prevalent in Eastern Iran, then moving to Western Iran. So I want to hear about that.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, here I have to thank our beloved colleague Frank Lewis, who points out in his history of the Ghazal, in his dissertation, that the first Ghazals that we actually see that seem like Ghazals as song texts are in romances. Like the Ayyubis, a big difference between Gorgani and Ayyubi is that Ayyubi actually has discrete Ghazal performances in the text. It'll be Masnavi, and then Shir Goftane Baghe, and then a Ghazal inserted into it, and then it returns to the Masnavi form. And I think like a really, as we were talking about this, I think the Iranian criticism can be very helpful because the term sher qanai can be used to describe both modalities. And I think there's a strong interrelationship between narratives and like basically song texts and storytelling, where they are really part and parcel of the same thing. We know that from accounts of like, from works like the Kitab al-Ghani that talk about the stories and the songs that were performed with the stories in the Abbasid court, right? So it takes a long time for the ghazal to sort of get reified as a kind of literary genre that's not necessarily, necessarily, shall we say, tied with a performance context or musical performance context, but always closely evocative of it, right? But yeah, I think these texts are really important for getting a sense for the early stages of this tradition as we can, or at least one part of access to them. It strikes us as, I mean, what's important is that it pushes back against any sense of a kind of discrete Iranian tradition in a sense, because you find so many similarities between the lyrics that Rāmin performs, for example, with lyrics that you find in Arabic poetry, like what's his name? Not Abdullah Tahia, Al-Abbas Ibn al-Ahnaf, right? Or in the case of Bargin Gosha, you find lyrics like literal shares that are performed by Bargé that seem to be translations literally from the Kitab al-Ghani's account of Orwa in the Afra. Like you can see the same line translated into Persian in Bargé's interpolated lyrics. So I think that also helps us think of the hybridity and fluidity and cross-linguistic jumping that's taking place before the rise of New Persian even. You know, that the Abbasid site is an important place of synthesis and fusion, so that it makes it harder to describe discrete Arabic and Iranian and even Hellenistic traditions. They're all kind of, they're cohabitating and becoming the same, occupying the same space and talking to each other as like not really distinguished along these national lines that we tend to draw today. There's certainly this idea of like the Arab or Ajam, but I don't think it's doing the same work as a nationalist reading of it would do. You know?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, question.
Go ahead, I'll ask you later.
I have one question. You know that the tension between the Parthian and Sasanian legacies.
Yeah.
Yes. Can we track a similar tension between the blood facing of the base and the mobile as a spirituality of the king? You know that because the Parthian has a material approach to the world, lesser than the spiritual or the spiritual approach of the Sasan. Maybe we can think about it, this tension between the materiality of the base and the spirituality of the Ram. Can we track?
It's an interesting question.
Think about it.
The problem is I know so little about the Parthian period in a sense.
Because it is Parthian romance and has source from that time.
Yeah. Well, that was the kind of I was trying to do something a little different, I guess. Again, moving from the kind of historical diachronic method of saying Parthian, Sasanian, Samanid, and so forth, to flipping it to a kind of comparative angle. And so I didn't really investigate it from that angle. I rather situated Mobad in the discourse of kingship. You know, like what an ideal king is supposed to do, of which we have abundant material in both Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. That was for me a very helpful kind of contemporary discursive model for reading Mobad. It's really, I guess I just don't know if I have the chops to look at Parthian kingship representations or expressions and say, aha, this is like some kind of vestige of that. I would leave that to.
You can think about it.
There's like a really interesting. Well, I think it's a strain of scholarship that's very mature. I would say I'm a literary scholar at the end of the day, and what I'm trying to show is that Vis Rāmin is a very interesting literary text. Rahim Shayagan has a really interesting study of Mobad, thinking about his connections with the story of Dara, Darius, and this legend of the evil twin brother in Hafamanishi times. So, like, there are people who are really qualified to do this kind of a diachronic study.
Yeah.
So I recommend Shayagan's article.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. Very, very interesting talk. I have a question regarding Gorgani's, or rather Nizami's relationship with Gorgani.
Yeah.
As somebody who works on the reception history of Khosrow Shirin in North India, I find it very striking that Nizami has a very paradoxical relationship with Gorgani's text, right? We see him mentioning Firdausi almost by name, or he refers to him in a very, very, but he presents, Gorgani is very absent, or he's absently present, right? And the only way he presents Vis in Khosrow Shirin is as an anti-model for Shirin.
Yes.
Right? How do you understand this relationship that Nizami establishes with his predecessor, whereas he mentions one predecessor and not the other? Do you think the scholarship, which considers Gorgani's text as an anomaly or as an aberration, feeds into Nizami's or is fed by Nizami's aversion to Gorgani's text, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful way to make it. I mean, Nizami is very consciously crafting his own place in history, right? And part of how he's doing that, so he's creating his own canon as he's writing, and so he clearly sees himself as doing something to expand and build on the foundations set by Firdausi. And at the same time, he's responsive to Gorgani, but also doesn't want, I mean, perhaps naturally, in carving out his own space, he doesn't try to compete with Firdausi. He's complementing Firdausi. But it would make sense for him to sort of downplay Gorgani as a stylistic model, in a sense. The same way that, like, we see Gorgani talk about Onsori. You know, like, Onsori did, like, just match, but I can do all the styles, you know, like, sort of like an active conscious supersession that may be part of it. It's interesting, in the scholarship I've read, I've seen arguments made both ways. People who read Nizami very carefully, I think the broader, the more common argument I've seen is that Nizami hates Gorgani and wants to, like, as we saw with Baki Daskir, that he sees something offensive in Vis. But I think it's helpful to also remember or to draw a line between the author and the narrator, for example. You know, he may have really liked Gorgani and felt like he could draw inspiration from it and do something even better.
But he does draw inspiration.
He does.
Yeah,
Exactly. So, do we expect to? Does that mean he dislikes the text, or that he liked it and wanted to supersede it? It's a complicated relationship, and maybe I guess for me it's hard to speculate as to what Nizami really felt about the text, but it's definitely an act of supersession. I feel, and there it does go back to this question about Vis's sexuality. I think it does. There's evidence for this, that not just in Nizami, the very first response to Vis Rāmin that we see in the tradition, as far as I've seen, is by Iran Shah ibn Elahé, who in his Batman Name has this great passage I can read for you if you want. Yes. He says, like, I can pull it up in a minute, but something like, "Oh, Gorgani told a story that froze men's hearts towards women." And his sympathy is all with Mobad. But he basically describes Vis as being like really awful, and that his own Katayun is is similarly punished for breaking for having sex outside of marriage, the same way that he says that he wished Vis could have been punished. So for sure, for many readers, there's a certain offense taken in there.
Yeah, and we see that in Nizami's reluctance portrayal of Shirin as well. We see how he marshals the narrative of her virginity on the one hand, chastity on the other, and then So I would like to. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I was very much impressed by the last verses you recited for
Oh,
us.
yeah.
And we sang,
Boundaries, yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
I was wondering how much it's common to have this form of presence of the beloved in the romantic, poetry in New Persian, especially the contemporary sources that have been introduced us. Have you encountered such, that form of, presence of the beloved in, let's say, Pier's works or, Gorgani's Pier's?
No, I think this is one of the features of Gorgani's style that many scholars have identified as pretty distinctive to him. Like in most of the scholarship I've read, usually does the Nizami Gorgani comparison. And usually the point is that Gorgani's characters are more physical. They have like the sort of tadasom, is sort of the idea that you can sort of touch them, you can see them. And indeed, the text itself has lines where Vis calls her readers to look at her body and learn from it, where she even strips herself in front of Mobad's emissary at one point and says, "Look at me. I have, like, you can, actually, like, you can, there's a certain, she embodies a certain kind of, or she uses her body in strategic ways, shall we say. So yeah, and Nizami definitely is kind of has his own style. He seems very much interested in kind of, metaphors and sort of a slightly more artificial in a positive sense, sort of sanat gadi, in a sense, like kind of create, like elaborating on the body to produce multiple meanings within a form. So it's
unique about
it seems to be one of his distinctive styles. I mean, even in his contemporaries, interestingly, with Unsuri, which I'm working with right now, there's a lot of interest in idolatry because it's set in ancient Greece. And so there's this whole debate that's done in the style of the symposium where they talk about what Eshk is. And one speaker describes Eshk in physical terms. He calls Eshk Dusti, who has a tiro kaman and little wings and like flies around and shoots people with arrows. And this very, like is talking about Eros, the god, right? And then Azra responds and says, how can you talk about love that way? Love doesn't have a body. Love doesn't have a form. It doesn't have a figure. So that you see this debate modeled in a sense about the body, basically, in that text. But Vis's body in particular, but bodies in general, I think Mobad's body as an aging body is really important too, and it's like an important element in his story. So yeah, I think Gorgani is just very interested in embodied experiences in some ways that are distinctive.
Oh, sorry. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question. I'm really interested in the debate of the character between Islamic law and her own ethics.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could please elaborate on that. Is she worried about the reaction of the society or not?
Yeah, that's really a really important point of the whole story, because part of the reception of Vis is that she's very scared about being misread, basically, as being an unethical person, as someone who violates the norms of romance. And indeed she was, by much of the tradition and even contemporary scholarship. She becomes a byword for, I'm trying to think like of, shame and that sort of thing. But there's passages that this is one of the focal points of my second chapter, where she becomes aware of the fact that there's no way for her to conduct herself that will not be condemned. Which I think is actually a powerful statement. Is one way you can read Vis Rāmin as a kind of proto-feminist in a sense, but something that understands in a sense that her position isn't impossible. And it makes us grapple with that there's no way for her to do the right thing. And thus she has to, and it's a very unique position. Usually the script is laid out, like, you know who you're supposed to be faithful to, you just practice that. And so there's this really interesting attainment of autonomy and agency in crafting her own standards by which she wishes to be judged that must necessarily go against various other perspectives. And so she, at the end of the day, announces she does this very carefully choreographed meeting with Rāmin, where she says, I will only do this if you uphold, like if on a contractual basis, basically. She establishes a contract between herself and Rāmin. And then having established that, even though she knows, or she's worried that Ramin's going to fall short, she at least has had a textual basis of saying, I have committed to a certain practice. I can trot it out and show it to other people and say, judge me on the basis of this contract, right? So then she proudly defies the king and other members of society, saying, like, I don't care if I'm being condemned, as all kinds of horrible things are said about her, because I've already established the contract on which I'm going to hold myself accountable. So there's this interesting theoretical discussion of romance by Paul Kottman that I found really interesting as a technology of self-accountability, a technology of knowing the self through one's relationships with others that is also kind of new. And so the idea of like public self-accountability that is ultimately contingent on your own commitment to something rather than on how other people see you is an interesting kind of motion that takes place.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I still have a question.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the possibility of building in this kind of proto-feminist work, especially like this self-definition of this.
Yeah.
Because like it seems to be very unique in the Romance tradition, in like Khosrow and Shirin as well. Shirin is like more self-controlled and she doesn't seem to be so self-conscious as Vis does.
Yeah.
So can we do that, or would it be like an imposition of some kind of modern feminist theory?
It's a great question.
Because of the first pronouns and like man on the sound.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a really bold state.
It is, yeah. Indeed, I said proto-feminist with a grain of salt myself. I think one important interlocutor for me was Minu Southgate, who writes about Vis in this way. That says that she's sort of, you see a kind of verbal rejection of patriarchal expectations, basically. The paradox, however, is that much of Vis's own self-representation is framed through normative and oftentimes misogynistic structures. Social quote, for example, Hadi saying that like Anisat Nuafas Lapul, for example, that women are not tamam in their deen and akhlaq and these things, as a way of affirming her authority, basically, that she and almost identifying with her readership, saying like, I am doing the thing, like I am trying to inhabit a space that ultimately sets me as subordinate to Rāmin. And at the end of the story, she, in fact, is made subordinate to Rāmin and sort of disappears into the background as Rāmin steps into the front, finally, as sort of like this perfect king after a very imperfect existence throughout most of the story. So it's, I think it can be read both ways in a sense. It does acknowledge, again, like the impossibility of Vis's situation and forces not only her, but us as readers to acknowledge and struggle with that. And that in itself is a very bold move. And I think building on Nasrin Naskari's work, that thinking about the possibility of female readerships of these works, that even if Vis is ultimately silenced, so to speak, by the end of the story, you don't forget these passages, these testaments that she says, like Manon Visan. She perdures, or she continues as a historical presence even after the text is over. So like the memory of the engagement that you have, there's something about the process of reading it that changes you and perhaps alters your perspective. And it may have been one that was really impactful perhaps for certain or like readers of the or readerships in the court that would have identified with her, perhaps. So I think I can read it in both ways, in a sense.
Last question will go to.
Okay, luckily no one has asked this question. Probably never will. So I'm wearing my historian's hat now.
Yes, yeah.
So one of the things that really struck me about Vis Rāmin, and it shares this characteristic with the Shah,
yeah,
is how much correspondence.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
They're writing letters to each other incessantly.
Yeah.
And the same is true in Shah.
Yeah.
You know, you get to one of your own of them. So this is a real characteristic of now we're learning more and more about the history of Sasanian chancery courses. You know, people are working stuff. So
yeah,
and obviously it must have been a characteristic of the Parthians as well, even though the Sasanians tried to do everything they possibly could to crush the Parthian past.
Spanish.
Everything, yes. So, in your view, this nomen aspect, I would just like to suggest a reading at the end, an alternative reading, that when she says, I am a nomen, she's a letter.
Yeah, yeah.
Because she read not a book, but a letter.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
Because she also has this dialogue,
yeah,
right? That she's writing in letter form. So, does that help move the action along? What is the role there of all that correspondence?
Well, yeah, especially in the case of Vis, I mean, much of my case rests on this idea of writing as a kind of self-inscription that lasts outside as sort of the creation of a historical memory, shall we say, or a memory that becomes historical.
Eternal.
Yeah, yeah. And in a way that's very different from Rāmin's. And so I think there's a lot.
He's writing too.
He writes, but not nearly with the same volume.
Yes.
That most of his speech acts are, interestingly, again, this is building off the Ghazal form. Much of his speech act is self-reflexive, as if he's like doing the tahalos. He's talking to himself. Even when Vis is in the room, he's talking, he says, like, oh, I finally attained my desire. And Vis is sitting right there and, you know, like but he's not talking to her. He's talking to himself through the modality of tahalos. Whereas Vis's course speech acts are either in the name form, she's writing letters, or in dialogue, she's talking to her nurse, as a lot of her speech acts, or talking to other people around her. So Rāmin does write a few very hurtful letters, really just one as far as I can think of. But most of his speech acts are this kind of singing or as if singing or internal monologues or all these. It's sort of like a kind of oral performativity, whereas Vis seems very much either dialogic or a written testament. Yeah, so I
remember, is there a figure named David?
There's a guy named Moshkin, I want to say, the scribe.
There, I'm sure. Just, you know, my own question triggered that.
Yeah.
So I think that course, but that's so, for me, so characteristic of that pre-Islamic period. And of course, the importance of chancery correspondence coming
I think
from into the Islamic world, from the pre-Islamic background.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Name has all those connotations of like something that exists, like the at name, basically, right? As a genre, something that one reads after the death of somebody. And so, yeah, I think letter is a good way to translate it. Any kind of written document really would be something anything that conveys that idea would be a good word to translate.
This is a question about travel. How did the documents travel between places and, you know, how did they get to one another?
Well, it's really, the evidence is really fragmentary. I mean, there's I'm blanking on her name. I apologize to the scholar. A Japanese scholar did this really interesting, wrote this really interesting study where she discovered one of the oldest exemplars of Persian written in Japan, the oldest, in fact, is a quote from Vis Rāmin. And it seems to have traveled from, from Iran to, it's called the port city of Zaytun, which I forget the Chinese name of it, like, is that Zhangzhou or something like that? It's near Guangzhou today. But Zaytun was an important merchant city where Muslim merchants would travel. And apparently this monk requested a bit of Islamic writing. And so the person who wrote down 2 lines from Vis Rāmin and a few lines from the Shahnameh. So that's one like tiny snippet of seeing how these things were passed on. Apparently this was an oral transfer. The person recited it from memory, and then it was, or he had memorized it and wrote it down for the Japanese monk. I doubt he carried the full book with him. And yeah, but beyond that, it's interesting. Like we don't have any early manuscripts of Vis Rāmin. It was picked up again in the Ottoman court. Which Sultan was it? Suleiman, I want to say, commissioned an Ottoman translation of Vis Rāmin that was highly boulderized and was completely rewritten by Lami. But it shows the availability of the manuscript at that time. Whereas Jami and Herat writes that he really likes Vis Rāmin, or that is a well-known story, but it's like Kamyabe or something like that. Like it's hard to find. And then later Indian critics say the same thing. One critic, Arzu Dagestani, actually incorporates a ton of Vis Rāmin into his own Tazkireh because he says, no, there's no other copies of it around. So I'll write down a lot of my favorite lines so that other people have access to it. And he says, he praises it very highly, actually. So I guess it seems to have been like, it was not ever a tale that seems to have received like priority in these ateliers, right? The Khamseh was always patronized the Shahnameh, other works, but it seems to have been more of like a middle sort of text. Like it must have circulated, but we don't see these prestigious illustrated copies.
Because when you say global, I think of television and things like that, which of course didn't exist. So then that made me think, well, you know, maybe they traveled, maybe books traveled with people that were taking money from place to place or something like that.
I think it was definitely a textual survival. Like it was the Indian copies that we have correspond with the Ottoman copies quite well. So it's being passed around, it's being copied and transmitted, but and quite far and wide. Certainly not literally global, but in the sense of like a trans-regional context, one that fits within the Persianate itself as a trans-regional linguistic space.
So this is just one more thought that people thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah. It seems to have this. My colleague Michael Pfeiffer had this really great idea for how to think of as transmission. Because even Morgani says like a story needs to travel if it's going to succeed. It can't just stay in the mouth of the poet. But modern literary theory around world literature, or like one prominent way of articulating it is by David Damrosch when he says literature is literature, world literature is literature that gains in translation. And Michael suggested, well, maybe in this case where you don't see lots of translations or copyings, but fragments of it here and there and everywhere, maybe there's also a case to be made for world literature as literature that gains in fragmentation. You know, it sort of disperses its seeds. You just find little pieces here and there, but there too, it's you find it, you know.
And then maybe ask for more.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are 2 online questions. I think those will be the last questions that we have to wrap up.
Yeah.
So the first question is by Katsuyo Motoyoshi.
Oh, yeah.
As I find the figure of the nurse interesting. This figure seems like a staple in many romance tales.
Yeah.
But have you found this to be the case? And do you think she is the figure that represents some occluded female tradition, wise woman, old witches, for example?
That's a great question, and thank you. I would say there's actually a whole monograph written on this by Leila Ruhi called The Nurse in Medieval Romances or something like that. I can look it up really quickly. Leila Ruhi has a whole book looking at the nurse figure in these comparative ways. The nurse is a staple, as you say, of narratives in this region from late antiquity and from antiquity. It's really she's a very old character, and very like one with a very long pedigree. So a great foray into the history of this figure is Leila Ruhi's work.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. Another question by Tigran Shahbaz. Thank you very much for your intriguing talk today. Have not read your book yet, but I look forward to reading it now. Can
I introduce something or say something really quick in this?
Of course.
I will say, by the way, the book is open access. So if you just look for it, if you Google it, you'll find the link for the open access book.
Good to know.
So this is the bad way.
So my question deals with the way you may position this narrative as a piece of word literature.
Yeah.
With multiple retelling in many languages, such as Georgian, and the place it holds in the emergence of romance/love stories in Persian and broadly speaking in word literature. Have you considered applying W. Propp's theory or on Thompson's index for the analysis of the narrative motives and the themes in this piece of literature?
Yeah, that's a great question. For sure, there's so many, like the nurse is a classic example of a motif that Stiff and Thompson would have in their index. And one way I actually did use Propp in thinking about Mobat and his function in the story as sort of like the obstacle/hero. What if you read him as the hero of the story, as some critics did? What if you read him as the obstacle of the love story, as other critics did? What I think, so that's certainly one way to do it, is just to do motif comparisons. But the thing is that motif comparisons are really valuable for drawing a really wide net. They capture all sorts of genres, all sorts of literatures. And I was trying to get a little bit more specific with what I meant by romance here, where it was something that existed beyond the reoccurrence of the nanny figure or of the love triangle or the talisman or the beloved kept in a tower. Like these are things that you can find in all kinds of traditions. And that wasn't enough to offer like a good grounds for comparison in the way I wanted to do comparative work, because if you focus more not only on the shared motifs, but also the way they are used, the way they're put together, then there you get a sharper angle into the comparability of what we now call romance in Western Europe, in Byzantine Anatolia, in Iran, that is more than just an amalgamation of motifs. It's like a way of using them and putting them into a story form that launches certain problems, that introduces certain intellectual questions. Almost romance is a way of doing philosophy. Why do we see this form then picking up steam as a prestigious literary form, moving beyond what we would call folk tales, which is what Stiff and Thompson are interested in, or Bob for that matter. It's like taking this material and doing something new with it that is not just visible in the Persian tradition, but indeed you find it in Georgian, Greek, German, and French as well, or kind of the big five. Interestingly, you don't see it in Armenian as much. There's interesting gestures towards it, but it seems to remain in more of like the folk story territory. Same too with Arabic. There's a very rich tradition of telling love stories in Arabic, but it takes on a different form. It doesn't take on these long form narratives. It's more like collections of akhbar around lovers. So the Arabic tradition utilizes this material, but sort of creates a different way of using it than its Persian counterpart. So that's a way of sort of offering a finer lens into what we mean when we say romance. Can we use it productively? What are the pitfalls and benefits of this particular term?
Wonderful. If there's no questions, I'll wrap the session for today. Thank you for your talk, inspiring book. Looking forward to reading it and suggesting everybody can now download it.
Yeah, you can download it. Yeah.
And read it. The last word definitely go to Dr. Talaki.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Frost, for your brilliant and thought-provoking presentation. And congratulations
Thank you so
on
much.
your tenure and promotion. And thank you for being here to celebrate it with us.
Yeah.
May I add something?
Yeah.
Your book was published by University of
Yes, thank you.
Crux.
Yes.
You know, something very unusual.
I forget people for Toronto for.
Often doesn't get that smart.
No, they actually, Suzanne Rancourt, I think saw this, like many other presses turned this project out. So I really appreciate her giving me, like, having faith in its viability.
Thank you very much.
No. Thank you everyone also for joining us online. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Have this.